Alyssa was a woman like no other. Every day, without fail, she embarked on a journey most would never dream of taking. 20 miles. Yes, 20 miles, on foot. Rain or shine, day or night. No one really knew why, but she did it silently, with determination burning in her eyes. For months she passed by the same houses, the same shops, the same streets, and yet nobody ever really noticed her. Or so she thought. Except for one man, Officer Greg Harris. Greg had been a cop in that small town for years, but something about Alyssa caught his attention. Every day at the crack of dawn, there she was, walking those miles with her head held high. At first he thought maybe she was just someone who liked to walk. Maybe she was training for something. But the more he saw her, the more it gnawed at him. Who walks 20 miles a day? Alone? One misty morning, as Greg sat in his patrol car sipping coffee, Alyssa walked past him again. This time, he couldn't resist. He started his car and followed her, keeping a respectful distance. His curiosity had gotten the better of him. He needed to know why she walked. Who was she? What was her story? The road stretched on, winding through neighborhoods that varied from rundown to well-off. He saw people glance at her, some with suspicion, others with indifference. One woman in particular, from a fancy-looking house, gave Alyssa a look that made Greg's stomach turn. A look of contempt, as though Alyssa's mere presence offended her. It was that moment that made Greg want to know even more. Who was this woman that walked with such purpose yet faced silent judgment at every turn? As Alyssa kept walking, Greg noticed something troubling. Her shoes. They were old, worn out, with bits of duct tape barely holding them together. He thought about pulling over, offering her a ride, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she walked, almost as if she wanted to keep the world at bay. Or maybe it was the flicker of something, fear, in her eyes the last time he spoke to her. Then it hit him. Maybe she had a reason to avoid help. Maybe there was something much deeper at play here. Could she be in trouble? Was someone after her? Greg's mind raced with possibilities, and each one was worse than the last. Later that day, Greg mentioned Alyssa to his colleague, Officer Darren, over lunch. "There's something about her," Greg said, his voice low. "Every day she walks for miles. No one knows her. But I've seen her shoes, Darren. They're falling apart. It's like she's running from something or someone." Darren raised an eyebrow. "Maybe she's hiding something. Could be trouble, you never know. People do crazy things to stay off the radar." That thought gnawed at Greg for days. Was Alyssa hiding? From who? From what? He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story. He decided to follow her again, this time more deliberately. He had to know. One evening, as Alyssa made her way back, Greg trailed behind her once more, but this time she took a different route. The sun had set, and the streets were dark, empty. She looked around nervously, before turning down an alleyway that led to the outskirts of town. Something felt off, and Greg's heart began to race. Why was she going this way? A sudden sound, a car backfiring in the distance, startled Alyssa, and she froze. For a moment, Greg thought she might run. But then, she started walking again, faster this time, her head down. Greg stayed far enough back so she wouldn't notice him, but he was tense, ready for anything. The streetlights flickered as he followed her deeper into the shadows. Suddenly, Alyssa stopped. She looked up at an old, dilapidated house at the end of the alley. It looked abandoned, the windows broken, the door hanging off its hinges. Greg watched from a distance as Alyssa hesitated, then slowly walked toward it. She pushed open the door and disappeared inside. Greg's instincts kicked in. Something was definitely wrong. This house didn't look like a place someone would go willingly. Was she being forced to go there? Was someone waiting inside? His pulse quickened as he quietly approached the house, his hand resting on his holster. He reached the door, peering inside cautiously. What he saw made his heart drop. Alyssa wasn't alone. Inside, two small children ran to her, throwing their arms around her legs. "Mommy, you're home," they cried. Alyssa knelt down, hugging them tightly, her face breaking into the first real smile Greg had ever seen from her. For a moment, Greg stood frozen, stunned by what he was seeing. The house, despite its outward appearance, was filled with warmth. There were toys scattered on the floor, drawings taped to the walls. But the most telling thing was the old car in the backyard, rusting away, its tires flat, a forgotten relic of better days. Alyssa had been walking all these miles, not to hide, but because she had no other choice. Her car had broken down long ago, and she couldn't afford to fix it. The long journey, the worn-out shoes, it was all for her children. Every painful step was for them. Greg's throat tightened. This wasn't a woman in trouble. This was a mother doing everything she could to give her children a better life. He stepped back, not wanting to intrude on the tender moment between Alyssa and her children. But as he made his way back to his car, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had just seen. His mind raced with guilt. How could he have been so blind? He had followed her, suspicious, thinking the worst, when all along she was fighting a silent battle of survival. That night, Greg lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. He had to help her. But how? Alyssa had been too proud to ask for help before, and he didn't want to make her feel like a charity case. But the thought of her walking another 20 miles tomorrow, her children waiting in that broken-down house, filled him with a sense of urgency he couldn't ignore. The next day, Greg decided to confront Alyssa. Not as a cop, but as someone who wanted to understand. As she walked past his patrol car, he pulled up beside her and rolled down the window. "Alyssa," he called out, keeping his voice calm and soft. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Alyssa froze, her eyes widening in surprise. She glanced around as if looking for an escape, but there was none. Slowly, she walked over to his car. "Yes, officer?" she asked, her voice guarded, wary. Greg took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I know you've said before that you're fine walking, but I'm concerned. I've seen you out here every day in those shoes, walking miles. And I saw where you went last night. I saw your kids, Alyssa." Her face fell, and for the first time, Greg saw a crack in her armor. She looked away, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had just landed on her back. "I'm not here to judge you," Greg continued gently. "I just want to help. You don't have to do this alone." Alyssa's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Greg thought she might turn and run. But instead, she took a deep, shaky breath and nodded. "I don't want charity," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Greg nodded. "It's not charity. It's community. Sometimes we all need a little help. I know you're doing everything you can for your kids, but you don't have to walk 20 miles every day. There are people who want to help you, who care." For the first time, Alyssa let her guard down. She wiped her eyes and looked up at Greg, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know how to ask for help," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I've been doing this for so long. I don't know any other way." Greg's heart ached for her. "You don't have to ask," he said softly. "We're offering. Let us help you." The next few days were a whirlwind. Greg reached out to the community, starting with Mike, the local mechanic, who agreed to fix Alyssa's car for free. Then he called local businesses, friends, and even the hospital where Alyssa worked as a cleaner. Word spread quickly, and soon donations began pouring in. New shoes, groceries, even a week's worth of meals for Alyssa and her children. The entire town rallied behind her, moved by her story. And Alyssa, she couldn't believe it. At first she resisted, her pride getting in the way. But as the days went on, and she saw the outpouring of support, something inside her shifted. She realized that accepting help didn't make her weak. It made her human. The day Mike delivered her fully repaired car was one Alyssa would never forget. Tears streamed down her face as she hugged her children, who bounced around excitedly, unable to believe their eyes. "Mom, we're gonna drive to school now, right?" her son asked, his eyes wide with excitement. Alyssa smiled through her tears, nodding. "Yes, baby, we're gonna drive." As she climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine roared to life. It wasn't just a car, it was freedom. Freedom from the long, painful walks. Freedom from the fear of being late to work. Freedom to give her children the life they deserved. But more than anything, it was a reminder that she wasn't alone. The people of her town had seen her struggle, and they had stepped in to help, not out of pity, but out of love and compassion. As Alyssa drove her children to school for the first time in months, her heart swelled with gratitude. She had spent so long walking, so long believing that she had to do it all on her own. But now, she knew better. The road ahead was still long, but now, she didn't have to walk it alone. And as for Officer Greg Harris? He stood by, watching Alyssa drive away, a smile tugging at his lips. In his years on the force, he had seen a lot of things. but nothing compared to the quiet heroism of a mother who walked 20 miles a day for her children. And nothing compared to the power of a community coming together to lift her up when she needed it most. This, he realized, was what it truly meant to serve, to notice, to care, and to act. And as the sun set on another day, Greg knew one thing for sure. Alyssa's story had changed him, just as it had changed the entire town. But just when it seemed like things were finally falling into place, a shadow crept back into Alyssa's life. It started subtly, an uneasy feeling that grew day by day. Her walks to work may have ended, but something far more sinister began to follow her, like a dark cloud she couldn't shake. One evening, as she was putting her children to bed, there was a knock at the door. Alyssa's heart skipped a beat. It was late, too late for visitors. She quickly tucked the kids in, kissed them goodnight, and tiptoed to the front door. Through the peephole, she saw nothing but darkness. No one was there. Her hand trembled as she slowly opened the door, just enough to peek outside. Still nothing. But then, she noticed it. At the edge of her yard, barely visible under the dim streetlight, there was a figure. Someone was standing there, watching her house. Alyssa's stomach churned with fear. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her heart pounding in her chest. Who was out there? Why were they watching her? The next day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She told herself it was just her imagination, that the stress of everything she had been through was catching up with her. But as the days went on, the feeling only grew worse. She started seeing the same car parked near her house, at odd hours, always in the same spot. At first, she brushed it off. Just a coincidence, she thought. But when it happened again and again, she knew it wasn't a coincidence at all. One night, after tucking her children into bed, Alyssa sat at the kitchen table, staring at the clock. The minutes ticked by slowly, painfully. Her mind raced, replaying every strange occurrence, every moment that had felt off over the past few weeks. And then she heard it, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Someone was outside her house again. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone. She dialed Officer Greg Harris's number, her fingers trembling so much she almost dropped the phone. "Greg, it's Alyssa," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "I think someone's watching my house." Greg was at her door in minutes, his expression grim. He had sensed something was wrong the moment Alyssa had called him, but seeing the fear in her eyes now made his blood run cold. "Stay inside," Greg instructed, his voice low but firm. "I'll check it out." Alyssa watched from the window as Greg stepped into the yard, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He circled the house, scanning the area, but whoever had been there was gone. All that was left was a faint trail of footprints leading away from the house and disappearing into the night. Greg came back inside, his brow furrowed. "There's definitely someone hanging around, but they're gone now," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "I'll have patrols drive by more often, but you need to be careful, Alyssa. Keep your doors locked and don't go out alone, especially at night." Alyssa nodded, but the fear gnawed at her. Who could possibly be stalking her? And why? The next morning, as she was driving her kids to school, she noticed the same car from before. It was following her, staying just far enough back that it could easily blend into traffic. Alyssa's knuckles turned white as she gripped the steering wheel. She made several turns, trying to shake the car, but it followed her at every turn. Panic surged through her. She thought about pulling into the police station, but she didn't want to alarm her children. Instead, she drove to the school, parked, and hurried the kids inside without looking back. Once they were safely in their classrooms, she rushed back to her car, her heart pounding. The car that had been following her was gone, but that didn't mean it wouldn't come back. Later that day, Greg met her for coffee. He could see the exhaustion and fear etched on her face. He leaned forward, his voice soft but serious. "Alyssa, do you have any idea who could be doing this? Is there anyone from your past, someone who might want to harm you?" Alyssa shook her head. "No one. I don't have any enemies, Greg. I don't know who could be behind this." Greg sat back, thinking. He had seen his fair share of dangerous situations, but something about this didn't sit right. This wasn't just some random stalker. It felt personal, calculated. But why? As the weeks dragged on, Alyssa's anxiety worsened. The car kept appearing, lurking in the distance, never getting too close but always there, like a predator watching its prey. She barely slept, her nerves constantly on edge. Every noise, every shadow sent her heart racing. Then one night, everything changed. Alyssa woke up to the sound of glass shattering. Her eyes flew open, and she bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering in her chest. She could hear footsteps downstairs. Someone was inside her house. Without thinking, she grabbed her phone and dialed Greg's number, her voice trembling with fear as she whispered, "Someone's in my house." Greg's response was immediate. "Lock your door. Stay with the kids. I'm on my way." Alyssa raced to her children's room, her hands shaking as she locked the door behind her. She gathered them close, holding them tightly as they trembled with fear. She could hear the intruder moving around downstairs, the sound of drawers being opened and things being thrown to the floor. What were they looking for? Minutes felt like hours as Alyssa waited, her heart pounding in her ears. Finally, she heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The intruder must have heard them too, because the footsteps stopped abruptly. There was a moment of silence, and then the sound of the back door slamming shut. Greg burst through the front door moments later, gun drawn, sweeping through the house. But whoever had been there was already gone, leaving behind nothing but broken glass and the eerie feeling of being violated in the one place Alyssa had thought was safe. As Greg surveyed the damage, his face was grim. "They didn't take anything," he said, looking around, "but they were definitely looking for something." Alyssa's mind raced. What could they have been after? She didn't have anything of value. Just a few old family heirlooms, some sentimental trinkets. Nothing that would make someone break into her home. So why? That night, Alyssa couldn't sleep. The fear had settled deep into her bones, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake it. Someone wanted something from her, and they were willing to break into her home to get it. But what? The next morning, Greg returned with more officers, determined to figure out who was behind this. They dusted for fingerprints, combed through her house for clues, but found nothing. Whoever had been there was careful. Too careful. Days turned into weeks, and still, no answers came. The car stopped appearing, the intruder never returned, but the fear remained. Alyssa's life had been turned upside down again, and this time she didn't know how to fix it. One evening, as she sat alone, her mind racing with possibilities, there was a knock at the door. Alyssa's heart jumped into her throat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, she made her way to the door, peeking through the peephole. To her surprise, it was Greg. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice unusually serious. Alyssa nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He walked past her, his expression grim. "I think I've figured out who's behind this," Greg said, his voice low. Alyssa's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" Greg took a deep breath before speaking. "It's not just one person, it's a group." Alyssa's eyes widened in shock. A group? Why would a group of people be after her? What could she have possibly done to attract that kind of attention? "There's something I didn't tell you before," Greg continued, his voice heavy with regret. "When we started investigating the break-in, we found a few things that didn't add up. It turns out you weren't just being followed randomly. Someone has been watching you for a long time." Alyssa's mind spun with confusion. "But why? I don't understand." Greg sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's your past, Alyssa. Something from your past has caught up with you." Alyssa's stomach dropped. She had no idea what he was talking about. Her past wasn't remarkable. She had always kept her head down, done her best to take care of her family. What could she possibly have done to bring this on herself? "I don't know the whole story yet," Greg admitted. "But I do know this. You're not safe. Not until we figure out who these people are and what they want." Alyssa's legs felt like they were going to give out beneath her. The room seemed to spin. She had thought the worst was over, but now it seemed like the nightmare was just beginning. "We're going to protect you," Greg said firmly, stepping closer. "I won't let anything happen to you or your kids, but you need to trust me. You need to tell me everything, even the things you might not think are important." Alyssa nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll tell you everything. I don't even know where to start." Greg placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Start from the beginning." And so, Alyssa began to unravel her past, a past she had tried so hard to forget, but now had no choice but to confront. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Greg realized that they were up against something much bigger than they had imagined. But they didn't have much time, because the shadows were closing in. As Alyssa sat across from Greg, the weight of her past began to press down on her like an anchor pulling her under. Her hands trembled slightly as she recounted the memories she had long buried, the things she had tried so hard to leave behind. Greg listened intently, his face set in a mixture of concentration and concern. "It was years ago," Alyssa began, her voice shaky, barely able to meet Greg's eyes. "Back when I lived in another town, I worked for a man. I didn't know it at the time, but he was involved in some really bad things." Greg leaned forward, sensing the tension in her words. "What kind of bad things?" Alyssa swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "Illegal dealings, smuggling, money laundering, even trafficking, I think. I only found out after I left. At the time, I was just working as an assistant, handling paperwork, answering phones. I never thought I was part of anything dangerous. But one day, I saw something I shouldn't have." Greg's eyes narrowed. "What did you see?" Alyssa closed her eyes for a moment, the memory still fresh despite the years that had passed. "I saw a transaction, a transfer of money between him and someone I didn't recognize. But it was huge, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it didn't make sense. The accounts were in other people's names, and there was this look on his face when he realized I had seen it. That was when I knew I had to leave." Greg's mind raced as he absorbed the information. It all made sense now. The stalking, the break-in, the careful surveillance of Alyssa. She wasn't just a random target. She was a loose end. "And you left after that?" Greg asked, already suspecting the answer. Alyssa nodded, her voice hollow. "I packed up my things and disappeared. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I changed my name, moved to a new town, and tried to start over. But I knew, deep down, that it might catch up with me one day. I just didn't expect it to take so long." Greg sat back, his mind whirling. Alyssa wasn't just running from a shadow. She was running from something far more dangerous. A network of criminals that wouldn't think twice about silencing her if they knew she was still alive. And now, after all these years, they had found her. "You said it was a group of people following me," Alyssa said quietly, her eyes searching Greg's face for answers. Do you think it's them?" Greg hesitated. He didn't want to alarm her more than she already was, but he couldn't lie either. "It's possible. They might have finally tracked you down." Alyssa's face paled, and she wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold the pieces of her life together. "What am I going to do? I can't live like this. And my children." Greg's voice was firm as he interrupted her. "You're not alone in this anymore, Alyssa. I won't let anything happen to you or your kids. But we need to be smart about this. If this group is as dangerous as it sounds, we have to move fast." Alyssa nodded, though the fear in her eyes was palpable. "What do we do?" Greg stood, his resolve hardening. "First, we make sure you and your kids are safe. I'll get a patrol car stationed outside your house, and we'll dig into this man from your past, find out who he is, what he's been involved in, and why he's after you now. But we need to keep a low profile. The last thing we want is for them to know we're on to them." Alyssa's heart raced as Greg's plan unfolded. She had spent years trying to forget that chapter of her life. But now, it seemed that the only way forward was to confront it head-on. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. There was no escaping her past. Not anymore. That night, Alyssa barely slept. Every creak, every gust of wind made her jump, her heart pounding with the fear that someone was just outside, watching, waiting. The patrol car Greg had stationed outside gave her some comfort, but the gnawing anxiety refused to let go. What if it wasn't enough? What if they found a way to get to her children? Morning came, but the sense of dread lingered like a dark cloud. She dressed her children for school, forcing a smile as they chatted innocently, oblivious to the danger looming over their heads. As she dropped them off, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting for her to be alone. Back at home, Greg called her with an update. "We've started looking into your old employer," he said, his tone serious. "And you're right, he's connected to some dangerous people. Organized crime, money laundering, all of it. But here's the thing, he disappeared years ago." Alyssa's stomach dropped. Disappeared? Yeah, Greg continued. No one's seen or heard from him in a long time, but his network is still active and we think they're the ones coming after you. They probably think you know too much or that you have something they want. Either way, we can't take any chances. Alyssa's breath caught in her throat. What do I do now? Greg's voice softened. We're working on it. We've got a few leads we're following up on, but for now, stay inside, keep the doors locked, and don't let anyone in that you don't know. I'm gonna keep you and your family safe, Alyssa. I promise. But promises, Alyssa knew, were fragile things. Days turned into a tense routine. Greg checked in with her regularly, updating her on the investigation, but there was no clear breakthrough. The patrols around her house became more frequent, but so did her unease. Every time she stepped outside, she felt eyes on her, shadowy figures lurking just beyond her vision. And then, one night, everything came crashing down. Alyssa had just put her children to bed and was sitting in the living room, trying to distract herself with the television, when the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, and her heart leapt into her throat. She stood up, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her phone to call Greg. But before she could dial, there was a loud knock at the door. Alyssa froze. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Her body was paralyzed with fear. She hadn't heard a car pull up, and the patrol officer outside had just left minutes earlier. Her phone buzzed in her hand, a text from Greg. I'm outside. Open the door. Relief flooded through her, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But something didn't feel right. Why hadn't Greg just let himself in? He had a key. And why was he texting her instead of calling? Her mind raced as she stood there, staring at the text. Something was wrong. Suddenly another text appeared. Alyssa, do not open the door. It's not me. Her blood ran cold. The phone slipped from her hands and clattered to the floor as the truth hit her like a freight train. Whoever was outside wasn't Greg. The knock came again, harder, more forceful. And then, a voice. Alyssa, open up. We just need to talk. The voice was calm, almost soothing, but it sent a chill down her spine. She backed away from the door, her pulse racing, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She knew that voice. It was him. The man she had run from. The man she thought she had escaped. The door rattled as the man tried the handle, and Alyssa's heart pounded so loudly she thought it would explode. Her children were upstairs. She couldn't let him get to them. She couldn't let him inside. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she picked up her phone again, her fingers barely able to text Greg back. He's here. Within seconds, Greg replied, I'm on my way. Lock yourself in a room, don't make a sound. Alyssa didn't need to be told twice. She bolted up the stairs, her heart hammering in her chest, and locked herself and her children in the bathroom. Her kids were awake now, frightened and confused, but Alyssa couldn't explain. She pressed her ear against the door, listening, praying that Greg would arrive in time. Downstairs, the man's voice grew more menacing. Alyssa, I know you're in there. You can't hide forever. The minutes ticked by like hours. Every sound outside the door felt like a countdown to disaster. Her children clung to her, their small hands trembling with fear, and Alyssa did her best to calm them, even though her own terror threatened to consume her. Then, suddenly, there was silence. No more banging, no more voices. Just quiet. Alyssa's breath caught in her throat. Was he gone, or was he waiting for her to come out? The silence stretched on, agonizingly long, until the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Alyssa let out a shaky breath, her body sagging with relief. Greg was here. Moments later, there was a knock on the bathroom door. Alyssa, it's me, Greg, it's safe now. Alyssa unlocked the door, her knees nearly buckling with exhaustion and fear. Greg stood there, his face a mixture of relief and fury. He's gone, Greg said softly, stepping closer, but we'll find him, I swear it. Alyssa nodded, though the fear still lingered in her chest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because now, they knew exactly where she was. And they weren't going to stop until they got what they came for. The hours after the break-in passed in a blur of fear, exhaustion, and adrenaline. Greg stayed with Alyssa and her children, ensuring they were safe as other officers combed the area for any sign of the intruder. But the man who had been at her door was gone, like a shadow slipping away before dawn. No fingerprints, no clues, just the lingering sense of dread that someone was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Alyssa sat on the couch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, while her children slept upstairs, unaware of the full terror that had unfolded. Greg sat across from her, his face tight with worry. "You did the right thing, locking yourself in that room," Greg said quietly. "But we need to talk about what happens next." Alyssa nodded numbly, though her mind was still racing, replaying the night's events over and over. The knock at the door, the fake text from Greg, his voice, on the other side. It was all too much. She had been running for years, but now it felt like there was nowhere left to hide. "What do they want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't have anything. I don't even know where he's been all these years. Why come after me now?" Greg's brow furrowed. He had been asking himself the same question. Whoever this man was, whatever network he was part of, they clearly believed Alyssa had something they needed. But what? Information? Leverage? Revenge? "I don't know," Greg admitted, his voice laced with frustration. "But whatever it is, they think you're a threat, and they're not going to stop until they get what they're after." Alyssa's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling in her lap. "I don't know what to do, Greg. I don't know how to protect my children from this. I thought leaving, changing my name, starting over, I thought it would be enough. But they've found me." Greg leaned forward, his voice firm but gentle. "You're not alone in this, Alyssa. We're going to figure this out. But we need to take some steps to keep you and your kids safe. I'm going to recommend moving you to a safe house for now. It'll give us time to investigate without putting you in harm's way." The thought of leaving her home, the only stability she had managed to build in years, filled Alyssa with a deep sense of dread. But she knew Greg was right. The man who had come to her door wouldn't stop. He had already proven he wasn't afraid to break into her home, to terrorize her family. Staying here would only make them sitting targets. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of the decision. "We'll go." Greg nodded, relief washing over his face. "I'll make the arrangements. It won't be forever, Alyssa, just until we can figure out what they're after and how to stop them." But deep down, Alyssa couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That no matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, these people would find her. She had been a loose thread in their world for too long, and now they were ready to tie up that loose end for good. The next morning, Greg helped Alyssa pack a few essentials for the move. Her children were confused, asking why they had to leave so suddenly, why they couldn't stay in their own home. Alyssa did her best to reassure them, hiding the fear that gnawed at her from within. But she could see the worry in their eyes. They sensed something was wrong. The safe house was quiet, tucked away in a small neighborhood just outside of town. It wasn't much, a modest, nondescript place meant to blend in with its surroundings. But it was secure, and that was all that mattered. The first few days passed uneventfully, though the tension hung in the air like a storm cloud, waiting to break. Alyssa tried to keep her children's lives as normal as possible, enrolling them in a nearby school and keeping to a routine. But every time she left the house, every time she picked up groceries or walked the kids to school, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, that the eyes of the past were still on her, waiting for her to slip up. Greg visited often, updating her on the investigation, though there was little new to report. Whoever was after her was careful, methodical. They weren't leaving tracks, and that made Greg more uneasy than anything. But it was on one of these visits, as Greg sat across from her in the safe house kitchen, that something in his expression shifted. He had a look she hadn't seen before, a mix of fear and determination. "We found something," he said, his voice lower than usual, "and it's bigger than we thought." Alyssa's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Greg pulled out a file from his jacket, placing it on the table between them. "Your old employer, the one you said disappeared years ago. He's not gone, Alyssa. He's still very much in the picture, and it looks like he's been watching you for a long time." Alyssa felt the blood drain from her face. "But he disappeared, I thought." "We all thought," Greg interrupted, his voice tight. "But he's been operating from the shadows. It looks like he went underground, restructured his operations. He's more dangerous now than ever. and from what we've gathered, he's been trying to find you for years." The room seemed to close in around Alyssa as the full weight of Greg's words sank in. This man, this ghost from her past, had never stopped looking for her. And now that he had found her, he wouldn't rest until he got what he wanted. "But why?" Alyssa's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why now? What does he want from me?" Greg hesitated, his jaw clenched. "We think he believes you have something that could expose his entire operation, and he's willing to do whatever it takes to get it back." Alyssa's mind raced, her thoughts spiraling in every direction. What could she possibly have that this man wanted? She had walked away from that life, left everything behind. She didn't have any incriminating evidence, no documents or files that could bring him down. But then a memory surfaced, something she hadn't thought about in years. It was back when she was still working for him, handling the mountains of paperwork that passed through his office. One day, a file had crossed her desk, full of numbers that didn't make sense, transactions that seemed out of place. At the time, she hadn't understood what they were. But now, as the pieces began to fall into place, she realized what it was. It had been a ledger, one that detailed his illegal operations. She had seen it, even if she hadn't fully understood it at the time. And if he thought she still had access to it, he would stop at nothing to get it back. Alyssa's hands began to shake as the realization hit her. "I don't have it," she said, her voice thick with fear. "I don't have anything. I didn't even know what it was at the time." "But he doesn't know that," Greg said grimly. "He thinks you have it, and that makes you a threat." The room fell into a heavy silence as Alyssa's worst fears were confirmed. She wasn't just a loose end. She was the key to unraveling everything this man had built, and he wasn't going to stop until he silenced her for good. "What do we do now?" Alyssa asked, her voice barely steady. Greg's expression hardened with determination. "We fight back. We expose him before he can get to you. But you have to trust me, Alyssa. This isn't going to be easy, and it's not going to be quick. But we'll take him down." For the first time in days, Alyssa felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile, barely a spark, but it was there. She had been running for so long, hiding in the shadows of her past. But now, with Greg's help, maybe, just maybe, she could finally face the man who had haunted her for years. The plan was set in motion quickly. Greg assembled a small team of trusted officers to work on the case, keeping the investigation under tight wraps. They couldn't risk tipping off Alyssa's former employer. If he knew they were closing in, it would only make him more dangerous. In the meantime, Alyssa stayed in the safe house with her children, the tension mounting with each passing day. Every time the phone rang, every time there was a knock at the door, her heart jumped, expecting the worst. But as the days stretched into weeks, the threat remained just out of sight, a shadow lurking in the distance. And then, one day, the phone rang, and Alyssa's world tilted on its axis once again. It was Greg. His voice was tight, urgent. "Alyssa, we found something. We need to move now." Alyssa's heart pounded in her chest as Greg explained the situation. They had traced a series of financial transactions back to a location, an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a known front for her former employer's operations, and they believed it held the evidence they needed to bring him down. But there was a catch. The warehouse was heavily guarded, and getting in wouldn't be easy. "We're going in tonight," Greg said, "but I need you to stay put. This is going to get dangerous." Alyssa's stomach churned with anxiety, but she nodded. "Okay, I'll stay here. Just be careful." Greg promised her he would. But as he hung up, Alyssa couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The shadows of her past had finally caught up to her, and now there was no turning back. As the night wore on, Alyssa paced the small living room of the safe house, her mind racing with fear. Hours passed, and still, there was no word from Greg. The silence was deafening, each minute stretching into an eternity. And then, bang! The sound of a car door slamming outside broke the stillness. Alyssa's breath caught in her throat. She rushed to the window, her heart racing as she peered outside. A car had pulled up, but it wasn't Greg. Her blood turned to ice. This was it. They had found her. The final confrontation was about to begin. Alyssa's heart slammed against her ribs as she watched the car idle in front of the safe house. The headlights cut through the night, casting eerie shadows across the front yard. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was this a trick? Had they finally tracked her down? Or was this some cruel twist of fate, an innocent passerby who had no idea the danger lurking just beneath the surface? She pressed her back against the wall, careful not to make a sound, as if the very air around her could betray her. Her kids were asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the chaos unraveling outside. Every instinct told her to run, but there was nowhere left to go. Suddenly, the car door creaked open, and a figure stepped out. Alyssa's breath hitched. The figure moved deliberately, walking around to the trunk. Panic surged through her. What was he getting from the trunk? Weapons? Tools to break in? Her hand trembled as she reached for her phone. She couldn't call Greg. Not yet. What if it wasn't them? What if it was just a misunderstanding? Her thumb hovered over the dial, paralyzed between fear and hope. But then, the trunk slammed shut with a deafening thud, and the figure stood motionless for a moment. Alyssa held her breath, praying that whoever it was would just leave. Then, to her horror, the figure turned and started walking toward the house. Her stomach twisted into knots. This was it. They had come for her. But then something unexpected happened. The figure stepped into the light of the porch, and Alyssa saw it clearly for the first time. A delivery man. He was carrying an oversized pizza box in one hand and a bag of what looked like sodas in the other. Alyssa blinked, her brain struggling to catch up with what she was seeing. Was this some kind of joke? Had they sent a pizza delivery guy to throw her off? Or was it possible? Was this just an innocent mistake? The man knocked on the door, and Alyssa froze, her mind torn between the absurdity of the situation and the lingering fear that this could still be a trap. Delivery for Alyssa? The man called, his voice hesitant, as if he wasn't quite sure why he was delivering food to a safe house in the middle of nowhere. Alyssa's eyes widened. What? Her confusion deepened, but the sight of a pizza delivery guy standing on her porch, completely out of place, threw her for a loop. There was no way this was real, was there? She hadn't ordered pizza. No one knew where she was staying except for Greg and a handful of officers. But there he was, standing in front of her door, looking perfectly harmless. Against her better judgment, Alyssa slowly cracked open the door, her heart still racing. The man stood there, looking as bewildered as she felt, holding out the pizza box like it was a peace offering from the universe. You didn't order this?" he asked, scratching his head. Alyssa shook her head, still trying to wrap her mind around what was happening. "No, I didn't." The delivery guy frowned, glancing at the receipt stapled to the pizza box. "Huh, well, it's all paid for. No address, just your name. Weirdest delivery I've had all night." For a moment, Alyssa stood there, stunned, unsure whether to laugh or cry. After everything, after the fear, the break-ins, the stalking, a pizza delivery was the last thing she had expected. And yet here it was, in all its ridiculous, cheesy glory. And then, in the midst of all the tension and fear, something strange happened. Alyssa laughed. It started as a small chuckle, but it quickly grew into something uncontrollable. Something that felt like a release after weeks of fear and anxiety. She couldn't help it. Here she was, hiding from dangerous men, thinking her life was on the line, and instead she was staring at a pizza delivery guy who clearly had no idea what kind of night she was having. The delivery man gave her a sheepish grin. "It's good pizza," he offered. Alyssa wiped tears of laughter from her eyes, still shaking her head in disbelief. I guess I could use it." She took the pizza, not entirely sure why, and closed the door. Her laughter faded, but it left her feeling lighter somehow, as if for just a moment the world had thrown her a curveball she could handle. She set the pizza down on the kitchen counter, her mind still buzzing with questions. Who had sent it? Was it Greg, trying to lighten the mood, or was this someone else playing games with her? Either way, the absurdity of the situation gave her a brief reprieve from the constant fear she'd been living with. But the moment of relief was short-lived. Her phone buzzed, and Alyssa glanced down to see a message from Greg. "We've been compromised. Stay inside. Do not open the door for anyone." Her heart stopped. Compromised? Her mind reeled. She rushed to the window, her earlier laughter now a distant memory, replaced by a deep, gut-wrenching fear. Greg's message wasn't just a warning, it was a reality check. The danger was still very real, and it was closer than ever. As she scanned the street outside, she saw it. A black SUV, parked just down the road, its tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. Alyssa's breath quickened. This wasn't the pizza guy. This was something much darker. The SUV's engine roared to life, and it slowly started moving toward the house. Panic surged through her veins. They had found her. She backed away from the window, her mind racing with every possible escape plan. She couldn't run. They would see her. She couldn't hide. They knew exactly where she was. The only option left was to wait, to hope Greg got there in time. But then something even stranger happened. The SUV didn't stop at her house. It didn't even slow down. It just kept driving. Alyssa watched in disbelief as the vehicle disappeared around the corner, leaving her standing in the middle of the kitchen, clutching the phone in one hand and the pizza box in the other, utterly confused. She stared out the window for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything, to make sense. But nothing did. The street was quiet again, eerily so, and yet the feeling that someone was out there, watching her, hadn't gone away. Her phone buzzed again, another message from Greg. "Stay calm, I'm on my way, we have to move you tonight." Alyssa's blood ran cold. Tonight? Already? She didn't even have time to respond before her phone rang. It was Greg. "Pack a bag, just essentials," he said, his voice urgent. "There's been a leak, we can't risk staying here any longer." "Who knows where we are?" Alyssa asked, her voice trembling. Greg hesitated on the other end of the line. "I'm not sure, but someone does. We intercepted a message earlier. It was coded, but it mentioned your safe house. We can't take any chances." Alyssa's stomach churned. Compromised. It was the word she had feared most since all of this started. She had trusted Greg, trusted that this safe house would be enough to protect her and her children. But now it felt like nowhere was safe. As she scrambled to pack, the earlier humor of the pizza delivery vanished completely, replaced by a sickening sense of urgency. Whoever was after her wasn't playing games, and this time they were getting closer. Minutes felt like hours as she threw clothes into a bag, grabbed her children's things, and tried to keep her hands from shaking. Every second that passed felt like a countdown to disaster. The sound of an engine outside sent her heart racing again, but this time, it wasn't a black SUV. Greg's patrol car pulled up in front of the house, and he stepped out, moving quickly toward the door. His face was tense, and Alyssa knew immediately that whatever was happening, it was serious. "We have to go now," Greg said as soon as she opened the door, his voice low and urgent. "Get the kids. Don't take anything you don't need." Alyssa nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat as she rushed to wake her children. They were groggy and confused, but she didn't have time to explain. They had to move, and they had to move fast. Within minutes, they were in the car, driving through the dark streets. Alyssa glanced out the window, half expecting to see the black SUV again, but the streets were empty. For now. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely steady. Greg's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Somewhere they won't find you." But even as he said it, Alyssa knew it was only a temporary solution. The shadows were closing in, and she could feel it in her bones. This wasn't over. Not yet. As Greg's car sped through the quiet streets, Alyssa couldn't shake the tight knot of fear coiling in her stomach. Her children were huddled in the back seat, still half asleep, their small hands clutching their bags as if they understood, in their own innocent way, that something was terribly wrong. The tension in the car was thick, heavy with unspoken questions and a shared sense of dread. Alyssa glanced at Greg, his face set in a determined grimace. The streetlights flickered by in a blur, casting fleeting shadows across his expression. He hadn't told her where they were going, and she wasn't sure if that was because he didn't know, or because the truth was too unsettling to say out loud. Are we safe?" Alyssa asked, her voice barely above a whisper, not wanting to alarm her children. Greg tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "We're safe for now," he said, though there was an edge to his voice that didn't inspire much confidence. "But we're not stopping until we're far enough away that no one can find us." The road stretched out ahead, seemingly endless, as the car slipped deeper into the night. The occasional hum of a distant car or the whisper of the wind was the only sound breaking the silence. Alyssa tried to calm her racing heart, but every mile felt like it was pulling her further into the unknown, away from the fragile semblance of stability she had been clinging to for so long. Then, in the midst of the tension, Alyssa's phone buzzed. She jumped, the sound startling in the quiet car. Her first instinct was to panic. Another cryptic text, another threat. But when she glanced at the screen, her breath caught in her throat. It was a picture of the pizza box, the one she had left back at the safe house, abandoned in the chaos of their hurried departure. And below the image, a single message. Bon appétit. See you soon. Alyssa's blood turned to ice. Someone had been inside the house. After they left, her mind reeled with the implications. How had they gotten in so quickly? Had they been watching her all along, waiting for her to make a move? And more importantly, who had sent the pizza? Greg glanced at her, sensing her sudden fear. "What is it?" he asked sharply. Alyssa handed him the phone without a word, her fingers trembling as she did. Greg's eyes darkened as he read the message, and a curse escaped his lips. "This isn't good," he muttered, tossing the phone onto the dashboard. "They're playing with us." Alyssa's chest tightened. "What do you mean? Playing with us? Like some sick game?" Greg nodded grimly. "They're trying to rattle you, make you scared, keep you off balance. They want you to panic, make a mistake." The thought sent a wave of anger through Alyssa, cutting through the fear like a blade. "But why? What do they want from me? I told you, I don't have anything. They're just messing with me now." Greg's jaw clenched as he sped through a red light, the urgency in his movements making Alyssa's pulse quicken. "They think you know something, Alyssa. Something big enough to make you a target. And until we figure out what that is, they're not going to stop." Alyssa leaned back in her seat, her head spinning. She thought about the pizza delivery, the strange SUV, and now this cryptic message. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure she felt hunted, and it was working. But what gnawed at her most was, why now? She had lived in the shadows for years, changing names, jobs, and towns, all to escape her past. So why had they suddenly surfaced now? The tension in the car was palpable as they continued driving through the night. The children had fallen back asleep, blissfully unaware of the danger that had seemed to follow them at every turn. But Alyssa's mind was a whirlwind of fear, doubt, and a flicker of hope that somehow, someway, Greg could protect them. Then, just as the quiet began to settle in, Greg suddenly veered off the main road onto a narrow, unpaved path that disappeared into the thick trees ahead. Alyssa's heart skipped a beat as the car bounced over the uneven ground. "Where are we going?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Greg glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable. "Somewhere they won't find us." Alyssa's eyes widened, but before she could ask more, the car emerged into a clearing, a secluded cabin nestled in the woods, far from the prying eyes of anyone who might be following them. It was small, almost hidden by the dense trees, but it radiated safety in a way that calmed Alyssa's nerves, if only a little. "We'll stay here for a while," Greg said, pulling the car to a stop. "It's off the grid, no one knows about it except a few trusted people." Alyssa stared at the cabin, her mind struggling to reconcile the rustic, peaceful setting with the danger that still loomed over them. She turned to Greg, her voice low and strained. "Is this really safe?" Greg nodded, though his face was still tight with tension. "It's the best we've got right now. We'll regroup, figure out our next move." They hurried the children inside, Alyssa feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. The cabin was simple, barely furnished, just the basics, but it felt like a fortress compared to the wide-open vulnerability of the safe house. As she tucked her kids into bed, whispering reassurances that even she didn't fully believe, Alyssa couldn't shake the feeling that they were living on borrowed time. Greg stood at the window, watching the tree line, his body tense, alert. Alyssa approached him quietly, her eyes filled with questions she didn't know how to ask. "Greg, what happens if they find us here?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Greg didn't turn to face her, his gaze still fixed on the dark woods outside. "They won't find us," he said firmly, but there was something in his voice, a flicker of doubt, maybe even fear, that made Alyssa's chest tighten. And then, just as the silence became unbearable, something completely unexpected happened. There was a loud from the kitchen, followed by the unmistakable sound of a cupboard door swinging open. Alyssa's heart leapt into her throat, and Greg spun around, hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. "What was that?" Alyssa whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Greg motioned for her to stay back, his expression tense as he moved toward the kitchen, his steps slow and deliberate. The seconds stretched out like hours, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. As Greg reached the kitchen door, his hand hovering over his gun, the cupboard door banged open again, followed by a strange muffled sound. And then, without warning, a cat darted out of the cupboard, a blur of fur and paws, knocking over a jar of sugar in its frantic escape. Alyssa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as a mixture of fear and relief flooded her system. Greg lowered his weapon, a look of disbelief crossing his face as he watched the cat disappear under the table. For a moment, there was silence. And then, unexpectedly, they both burst out laughing. It was the kind of laughter that came from sheer exhaustion, from the absurdity of the situation, from the fact that after everything, after all the fear, the tension, the pizza, and cryptic messages, it was a rogue cat that had nearly pushed them over the edge. Greg shook his head, still chuckling as he holstered his weapon. "I swear, this night just keeps getting weirder." Alyssa wiped tears from her eyes, her laughter fading into a deep sigh. "We're running for our lives, and a cat nearly gives us both a heart attack." Greg smirked, glancing at her with a rare glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "Maybe it's a sign. Things can't possibly get crazier than this." But even as the humor lingered between them, the reality of their situation remained, looming over them like a shadow. The cat was gone. The cabin was safe for now. But the danger was still out there, lurking in the dark. As the night wore on, Alyssa couldn't shake the feeling that this brief moment of levity was just the calm before the storm. They might have escaped for now, but the game wasn't over. Not yet. And the players in this game weren't the kind to quit until they had what they wanted. As the laughter between Alyssa and Greg faded into the quiet of the cabin, the gravity of their situation slowly returned. The cat had provided a brief, almost absurd distraction, but the reality was still heavy. The shadows of her past were still creeping closer, and every moment of respite felt like borrowed time. Greg remained at the window, his eyes scanning the darkness outside, ever alert. Alyssa could see the weight he carried. He had taken on this mission to protect her and her children, but there were no guarantees. It was only a matter of time before they had to confront the looming threat head-on. The cabin, isolated and off the grid, offered some protection, but the night felt more oppressive than ever. Alyssa sat on the edge of the couch, staring blankly at the old wood-paneled walls, the low flicker of the fireplace casting shadows that danced unsettlingly around the room. Her mind raced, thoughts colliding in a jumble of fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty. What now? She finally asked, breaking the silence. "We can't stay here forever." Greg turned from the window, his face serious. "We need a plan. We can't just keep running. Sooner or later, we have to go on the offensive, figure out exactly what they want and why they're so determined to come after you." Alyssa nodded, but the idea of confronting the very people who had been hunting her for years felt impossible. "I don't even know what they think I have," she murmured. "It's been so long. I've tried so hard to forget." Greg sat down across from her, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "It has to be something connected to your old employer, something that could bring his operation down. You said you saw files, documents, anything in those you might have overlooked?" Alyssa racked her brain, trying to recall every detail from those days. It was a blur now, a part of her life she had buried under layers of new identities, new jobs, new places. There were transactions, money going to strange accounts, but I never kept anything. I was just trying to survive. Greg sighed, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "They're convinced you have something, or at least know something that could hurt them. We need to find out what that is before they do." The fire crackled softly, filling the silence between them. Alyssa knew Greg was right. They couldn't just keep running. But the thought of going up against a powerful criminal network, the same people who had already proven they could find her, no matter where she hid, sent a shiver down her spine. As if sensing her hesitation, Greg leaned closer, his voice firm but kind. "You're not alone in this, Alyssa. We'll take them down together. But you have to trust me. We're going to fight this, not just survive it." Alyssa met his gaze, feeling a flicker of hope but also fear. What if we fail? She whispered. Greg didn't flinch. We won't. The confidence in his voice was reassuring, but it wasn't enough to erase the lingering dread in her heart. Still, Alyssa knew she couldn't keep running forever. She couldn't let her children grow up in fear, always looking over their shoulders, wondering when the next threat would come. Greg pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts, thinking aloud. We need to gather information, fast. I've got some people I trust, good people, who can help. But we'll have to move carefully. If they catch wind of what we're doing, they'll tighten their grip. Alyssa nodded, her mind already bracing for the next step. But just as she was about to respond, the sound of an engine rumbling in the distance caught her attention. Her heart leapt into her throat. Greg was instantly on alert, his hand reaching for his gun. He motioned for her to stay back as he crept toward the window, peeking out cautiously. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the engine grew louder, the headlights slicing through the thick trees as a car approached the cabin. Alyssa's stomach churned. Had they found her again? So soon? Greg turned to her, his expression tense. Get the kids. Stay in the back room. Alyssa didn't need to be told twice. She rushed upstairs, her hands trembling as she gathered her children from their beds. They stirred sleepily, confused and disoriented, but Alyssa's urgency pushed them to wake up quickly. Mommy, what's happening? Her daughter asked, rubbing her eyes. Alyssa forced a smile, trying to keep her voice steady. It's just a little precaution, sweetheart. We're going to stay in the back room for a bit, okay? She led them to the farthest room in the cabin, a small space with a single window that overlooked the dense forest. She locked the door behind them, her heart pounding as she listened for any signs of trouble downstairs. Greg was still by the window, watching as the car pulled up to the edge of the clearing. The headlights dimmed, and the engine cut off. For a moment, everything was still, the tension in the air thick enough to suffocate. Then, to Greg's surprise, the car door opened, and out stepped a man he recognized immediately. It was Jason, one of Greg's most trusted friends from the force. Relief washed over Greg like a wave, but it was short-lived. Jason wouldn't be here unless something had gone wrong. Very wrong. Greg opened the door, stepping out onto the porch. Jason, what the hell are you doing here? He asked, his voice low but urgent. You weren't supposed to know about this place. Jason approached quickly, his face grim. We've got a problem, Greg. A big one. Your location's been compromised. Greg's stomach dropped. How? I didn't tell anyone except... Doesn't matter. Jason cut him off, glancing nervously around. They know you're here. They're moving fast. We've got maybe an hour, tops. Greg's mind raced. This was worse than he'd thought. How did they find us so quickly? Jason shook his head, his voice tight. It doesn't matter. We have to go. Now. They're not playing games anymore, Greg. They're coming, and they're bringing everything they've got. Greg cursed under his breath, his mind spinning with 1,000 different thoughts. This was supposed to be a safe place, the last line of defense. But now it felt like a trap closing in around them. Get the car ready, Greg ordered, his voice sharp. We're leaving in 5. Jason nodded, sprinting back to the car as Greg rushed back into the cabin. Alyssa was waiting at the top of the stairs, her face pale with fear. They found us, didn't they? She asked, already knowing the answer. Greg nodded, his expression serious. We're moving. Right now. Alyssa's heart sank, but she didn't argue. She grabbed the bag she had packed earlier and woke her children, hurrying them down the stairs as Greg and Jason prepared to leave. Within minutes, they were back in the car, speeding down the narrow path, the headlights barely cutting through the thick trees. The tension was suffocating, every bump in the road sending Alyssa's nerves into overdrive. Greg glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his voice calm but urgent. We're gonna make it, Alyssa. Just hang on. But as they sped down the dirt road, Alyssa couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Because now, the hunt was on. And this time, their enemies weren't going to stop until they had her in their sights. The car hurtled down the narrow, winding road, each bump jostling Alyssa and her children in the back seat. The tension inside the vehicle was thick enough to cut. Greg's jaw was clenched as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes flicking constantly between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. Jason sat in the passenger seat, his phone in hand, eyes scanning it for updates. his expression unreadable. Alyssa's heart leapt into her throat. "Greg, what are—" Jason shrugged, his fingers still flying across his phone. "Doesn't everyone?" Despite the gravity of the situation, Alyssa almost laughed. Of course, Jason had a guy for that. The absurdity of the moment, a rogue cat, a pizza delivery, and now a tech-savvy friend who could help them disappear, wasn't lost on her. But she didn't care. If this guy could buy them even a few extra minutes, she'd take it. "Okay, it's done," Jason said after a moment, his face lit by the glow of his phone. "Our trail should go cold for them, at least long enough to get some distance." Greg nodded, his relief visible. "Good, now let's find somewhere to hide." The road ahead opened into a clearing, and Greg slowed the car, turning toward a group of old abandoned cabins nestled in the woods. The cabins were decrepit, almost forgotten by time, but they offered the perfect cover. Hidden, isolated, and out of sight. Greg parked the car behind one of the larger cabins, and they all scrambled out. The forest was eerily silent, the trees standing like dark sentinels under the moonlit sky. Alyssa quickly gathered her children, urging them to stay quiet, while Greg and Jason scanned the area for any signs of danger. "This should buy us some time," Greg whispered as they crouched behind the cabin. "But we need to figure out what we're up against." Alyssa's heart pounded in her chest. But there was something else now. Something besides fear. It was a flicker of resolve. They had been running for too long, reacting to the threat without ever truly understanding it. If they were going to survive this, they needed to stop being hunted and start fighting back. "We need answers," Alyssa said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "And we're not going to get them by running forever." Greg met her gaze, his eyes narrowing with determination. "You're right, we need to hit back. But first, we need to make sure you and your kids stay alive." Jason, still glued to his phone, looked up with a half smile. "Well, I've got more good news. My guy just sent me something else. Looks like the people tracking us? They're not just criminals. They're working for someone high up, someone with serious connections." Alyssa's blood ran cold. "Connections? High up?" "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jason glanced at her, his expression dark. "It means this goes deeper than we thought. And whoever is after you, they've got resources we can't even imagine." Alyssa's knees nearly buckled at the weight of it all. The endless running, the near misses, it wasn't just about her old employer anymore. It was bigger, more dangerous. But as terrifying as that realization was, Alyssa felt something else stir within her, a flicker of determination. If they wanted her, if they wanted her children, they would have to go through her. And she wasn't going to make it easy for them. As the night deepened and the forest closed in around them, Alyssa, Greg, and Jason huddled together, formulating their next move. They were done running. It was time to fight back. Because no matter who was after them, they weren't going down without a fight. As dawn began to break over the horizon, the forest that had once seemed so threatening now felt almost peaceful. Bathed in the soft glow of the morning light, Alyssa stood at the edge of the clearing. Her children still asleep inside one of the abandoned cabins, safe for the first time in what felt like forever. Greg and Jason had been up all night, working tirelessly to piece together the final parts of the puzzle. With the help of Jason's tech-savvy friend, they had uncovered the full extent of the conspiracy that had been hunting Alyssa. Her former employer, long thought to be operating alone, was in fact part of a much larger and more dangerous network, stacked with ties to powerful figures in politics and business. They were after Alyssa because they believed she had information that could expose them all. But now, thanks to the quick thinking of Greg and Jason, the tables had finally turned. They had gathered enough evidence to go public, to blow the lid off the entire operation. And with that, Alyssa's nightmare was about to end. Greg approached her quietly, his face etched with both exhaustion and satisfaction. "We did it," he said, his voice low but full of conviction. "We've got everything we need. By the time the sun sets tonight, every major news outlet will be covering this story. They can't touch you now. Not with this kind of attention." Alyssa turned to him, the weight of the last few weeks finally lifting from her shoulders. She felt a wave of relief so overwhelming it nearly brought her to her knees. For the first time in years, she was free. "Thank you," she whispered. her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." Greg smiled, a softness in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "You don't have to. You've been through enough. It's time for you and your kids to start living the life you deserve." Alyssa nodded, tears filling her eyes as she looked back at the cabin where her children slept peacefully. They would finally be safe. And that was all that mattered. Jason walked up behind them, grinning as he held up his phone. "I've just sent everything off to my contacts. The wheels are in motion. By the time they realize what's happened, it'll be too late." The three of them stood in silence for a moment, letting the weight of their victory settle in. It hadn't been easy. There had been too many close calls, too many moments of fear and uncertainty, but they had made it through. Together. Alyssa turned to Greg, her eyes shining with gratitude. "What happens now?" Greg glanced at Jason, who gave a knowing nod, before turning back to Alyssa. "Now, you go home. You take your kids, you start over, and you never look back." Alyssa smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with hope for the future. Home. It was a word she hadn't allowed herself to think about for so long. But now, it felt real. It felt possible. As they made their way back to the cabin, Alyssa knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter. One where she didn't have to live in fear, where her children could grow up in peace, and where she could finally be free from the shadows of her past. But before they parted ways, Jason turned to Alyssa with a playful grin. "So about that pizza, you think we should order another one to celebrate?" Alyssa laughed, the sound light and free. "Only if you promise not to scare me half to death this time." Jason chuckled, giving her a wink. "No promises." As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its warm light over the forest, Alyssa realized that for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. And with Greg and Jason by her side, she knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. To all of you watching this incredible journey unfold, thank you for being part of Alyssa's story. If you've been as captivated by the twists and turns as we have, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and follow our channel for more stories of resilience, courage, and hope. There's always more to discover, and we'd love to have you along for the ride. Stay tuned for what's next. You won't want to miss it.